You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
So we're currently going to what we call Treloar E, which is the latest building that the War Memorial has constructed, and it's being built purely to house our aircraft collection.
Cameron Ross is a curator in the Military Heraldry and Technology section. This new building in the Canberra industrial suburb of Mitchell is next to the memorial's original large storage facility and provides more than 5,000 square metres of extra space.
It's designed to be able to carry, to hold the largest objects in our collection, which are the aircraft, and when G for George is taken off display, he'll be able to fit in here with his wings up and everything. So we've got very large aircraft in here, including our F-18, but also even larger things like our P-3 Orion, maritime patrol aircraft, which is even larger than G for George.
And G for George, of course, is the Lancaster bomber.
Correct, yes.
We featured the much-loved G for George in episode 15 of Collected. Today we've come to see two other very special aircraft, the oldest plane in the memorial's collection and the most modern and the most recent acquisition. So here we are inside this huge warehouse.
It is, brand new smell to it, and as you can see there's a lot of space still here, and that's all going to be filled in the next coming months.
Let's look at the oldest aircraft here, which is also the oldest aircraft in Australia?
Well, it's definitely the oldest military aircraft in Australia. It came to Australia in 1913, and we'll head over to it now.
I love the polished concrete floor.
Yeah, isn't it great? It's really good on your feet.
This historic aircraft is over the far side of this enormous hangar-like space.
So this is our Depoduson Monoplane. So it's a 1910 design aircraft, but purchased by Australian government in 1912 and brought out to Australia in 1913 as one of the original 5 aircraft purchased for became the Central Flying School down at Point Cook.
Well, I've got to say, Cameron, it's more a skeleton of an aeroplane, isn't it, really?
It is. It's closer to the Wright brothers technology than it is to anything else. As you can see, it's a wooden frame connected by wires with a tiny little 3-cylinder engine that creates a whopping 35 horsepower.
This is the actual sound of a restored 1910 Depoduson that was flown a few years ago at an air show in England. You can see the video on the Wings YouTube channel. And look at the wheels on it. They look like bicycle tyres.
They are. They're flimsy little bicycle tyres to land with skids as well to assist with the landing. It's all very roughly made, very quickly made.
Where are the wings? There are no wings on this aeroplane.
So the wings have been stored separately. We do have some of the tail wings here that show you sort of the style of the wings, which is, again, that wooden frame but wrapped in linen.
And they're not attached to the aeroplane, they're on the plinth that's holding the plane.
That's correct. So for storage reasons, all of our aircraft that are stored in this building have their wings removed if possible. Some aircraft, it is impossible to do that, but with the Depoduson we have been able to remove a fair few items for storage.
So what are the wings made out of?
Just like the rest of the aircraft, the wings are made out of a wooden frame with wires, and they're covered in a linen called Irish linen, which is highly flammable, but covers the whole wing structure and the underside of the aircraft as well at the front there, as you can see.
The propeller is quite lovely, isn't it? That's a beautiful polished wood.
It is. It's the good old days of beautifully made wooden propellers. This is a single propeller, 2-bladed propeller. So First World War period you have these wooden propellers, and in the Second World War you start to move on to the metal ones, and far more propeller blades than the single blade we have here.
As Cameron said, this Depoduson Monoplane was one of the first 5 planes brought to Australia for the establishment of our first military flying school. That original batch included 2 English Royal Aircraft biplanes, a Bristol box kite and another Depoduson. So where were the Depodusons from?
Depoduson is actually a French company, but they had a offshoot in the UK that produced this particular aircraft. Depoduson himself was a silk merchant, made his millions in silk, and at the earliest stages of aviation decided to develop a company. He found an aeronautical engineer who could help him build aircraft, and he started building aircraft to win racing competitions, but that eventually turned into military contracts as well. So he started to develop aircraft for the British military and the French military. And in 1912, the Australians bought the 2 Depodusons from the British offshoot of his company. Armand Depoduson himself was a very interesting character. He spent money like it was going out of fashion, and in 1913, he was actually arrested for fraud. He actually defrauded his bank by anywhere up to 40 million francs. He was arrested for that and wasn't tried until 1917 and was found guilty and was sentenced to 5 years, but it was suspended because he'd already served time. And because of the company that he created, the Depoduson Aviation Company, was transformed into what became SPAD, which was one of the leading French aircraft manufacturers in the First World War and produced thousands of aircraft for the country. So in 1917, it was seen as, he had helped create the industry that helped France survive the First World War. So he got off, but it was a very tragic end to his life. 1924, his life is ruined. He's got no money anymore. His wife has left him, and he's living in a cheap hotel. He gives all of his money that he's got in his pocket to a newspaper salesman at the railway, then goes back into his room, asks not to be disturbed, takes all his clothes off, leaves a note to say that all these clothes are to be given to that old man who's selling newspapers down at the railway, and then shoots himself. So he's instrumental in that early stages of the aviation industry, but he has this really tragic end to his life, unfortunately.
A tragic end indeed. But let's return to the story of the aircraft manufactured by the Depoduson Company. The 2 monoplanes purchased by the Australian government were shipped out to Australia in mid-1913. But who would fly them?
So before the aircraft were purchased, the Australian government did an advertising mission in the UK to find some qualified pilots who could lead the school that Australia was going to set up. And the 2 pilots that were selected were a British pilot by the name of Henry Peter. So he was the first commanding officer of the flying school, and he helped select the aircraft that were chosen. It just so happens that he was working for the British Depoduson Company at the time. And the other was Eric Harrison, who was actually an Australian-born pilot who went to the UK to learn to fly. So he was coming back to Australia to teach other Australians to fly. And he was more inclined to another one of the aircraft that was selected, which was called a box kite, Bristol box kite. So Harrison worked for Bristol, and he was more familiar with that aircraft. So the first flight in Australia was on the box kite, and the second was with the Depoduson by Henry Peter.
Were many people enrolled in that first flying school at Point Cook?
So the first flying lessons were very small numbers that they enrolled. Quite a few applicants were refused. And you actually see during the First World War quite a few Australian pilots who flew with the British because there just weren't enough places in the flying school down at Point Cook to help them. So some of our most famous pilots, like Robert Little, had to go to the UK to learn to fly because they just couldn't here in Australia because there weren't enough positions.
And the RAAF wasn't even formed then?
No, they didn't form until after the war. So the Depoduson here was actually retired from its duty and joined what became the Australian War Memorials Collection in 1920. And the Royal Australian Air Force was formed in 1921.
So how was this particular aircraft used at the flying school?
So the 2 Depodusons that were purchased, one was supposed to be for flying and the other one was for training in taxiing. This is the taxiing training one. It can still fly, and it did fly on occasions, by mistake mostly.
What do you mean by mistake?
If we move a bit further this way, we can see at the tail of the aircraft there is some fabric has been wrapped around it, and that's to repair damage from what we call hops, where they've flown a little bit by mistake and come down heavily.
When they were taxiing, so they're going along the runway and suddenly they go up in the air.
Exactly, and they've snapped it in two, basically.
Broken the plane.
Broken the plane in two by these hops, and you can see the repair work that's been done to it.
Wow.
So it is capable of flight, but it was technically supposed to train people in how to taxi on the ground.
So this particular plane may never have soared up in the sky.
No, most likely did not. The other Depoduson, within a week of its first flight down at Point Cook, it was being flown again by Henry Peter, and he was trying to dodge a telegraph pole and crashed it quite severely, and the plane was a write-off. So there was only a very few flights of Depodusons in Australia because of that, and the other one was written off, and this one was relegated to just being the taxiing aircraft.
Given its fragility and its age, it's amazing that it survived, and I suppose that's because it was given to the War Memorial so early.
It's definitely amazing that it has survived. Unfortunately, the skin of the wings is a replacement. So when it actually arrived in Australia in 1913, it had been crated in the UK in wet conditions, and then had gone through months of on a ship. When they opened it, it was all mouldy and awful and had to be completely replaced. So the skin was replaced in 1913, and then was again replaced in 1937, and then replaced again in 1950. So it's definitely not the original linen, but all the other components are still the original, and that's sort of a testament to the sturdiness of wood as a product. When it's stained and well taken care of, it can last for a very, very long time.
I've got to say, Cameron, that this flimsy little wooden plane is also a testament to the courage of the first pilots, they were mostly men, who, even though we had some fantastic early female pilots as well, but at the Point Cook Flying School they were men, who were brave enough to get behind the wheel of this.
And that's exactly it. I would certainly not want to get behind this one. Even though it doesn't have much power to get you anywhere, it's very flimsy. You warp the wing instead of having flaps and ailerons. You warp the wing, and you've only got a very unpowerful engine. You've got a big steering wheel and only one dial, which is to tell you how much fuel you've got left. So you've got no comforts, no anything to support you as you fly. It's very, very dangerous, but the pioneers of aviation did it because it was risky and they were adventurous.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. Time now to take a look at the other aircraft we've come to see today. A Royal Australian Air Force fighter jet that was handed over to the memorial in December 2020. So this is a very impressive, sleek machine. Cameron, what are we looking at here?
So what we're looking at here is the most modern aircraft in the War Memorial's collection now. It's the FA-18 Hornet. So this is the main, up until quite recently, the main fighter aircraft of the Royal Australian Air Force, and is a giant leap forward in aviation technology compared to the Depoduson we were just looking at. The Depoduson's top speed is 80 kilometres an hour if you're lucky. This one goes 1.8 times the speed of sound, so about 1900 kilometres an hour. So as far as technology, they're not even on the same planet anymore, really.
To give the aircraft its full name, it's the FA-18 Classic Hornet A21022. It's the first of two FA-18s that will have their final home at the memorial. The other is due to arrive in mid-2022.
So the F-18 is an American aircraft. It was actually produced for the United States Navy. So it is an aircraft designed to be landed on aircraft carriers. It was designed and built started to be built in the 1970s, and the Australian government purchased them in 1981, with the first arrivals in 1985. This particular one arrived in 1980 1988 and served until 2020. So it has a very long service period.
That says something about the quality of the manufacture and obviously the design of this aircraft.
It does. I mean, we're talking about very strong materials here, titanium and composite alloys and things that are exceptionally strong. And we're also talking about an industry that it takes so long for things to be developed now, whereas the Depoduson was designed in 1910, purchased by the Australian government in 1912, and obsolete before it arrived in 1913. This was designed in the 1970s and is still a leading-edge bit of technology today, with many advancements over that time period, but it's still a very, very good fighter aircraft today.
People would be very familiar with the look of this. It's a classic jet fighter design with the, I presume, perspex bubble where the pilot sits. Is there just one person in this plane, or is there room for a co-pilot? I can't quite see.
So this is an A model, so it's a single-seat fighter aircraft. There is a B model, which is the two-seater, which is used for training pilots, but traditionally it is a single-seat fighter aircraft.
The 1910 Depoduson is also a single-seater. But the pilots who flew that old plane sat on top of the fuselage, exposed to the elements with virtually no protection. As you get up closer to the FA-18, you can see markings on the side, stencils of a kangaroo and a magpie, 3 rows of bombs, and the name of one of the pilots who flew it.
Yeah, so all those markings tell the history of the aircraft itself. So you have Wing Commander Michael Grant, so it's his aircraft, Cletus being his nickname, in the squadron. The bombs that you mentioned are for its combat missions in the Middle East. So at the top you've got a group of 4 bombs with 2003 above it. So that's when it was used in Operation Falconer in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq. So it was involved in 4 combat bombing missions, which were the first bombing missions by the Royal Australian Air Force since Vietnam War.
So the bombs indicate the missions, not the number of bombs dropped?
Yeah, so they're the bombing missions. So they did what they called 20 combat missions, so patrols and things, but only 4 of them resulted in dropping of ordnance. So there's 4 bombs on it.
And if we go a little closer, I can see that beneath that we have 2016, 17 and 3 rows of bombs. What were those missions?
So that was for the deployment it did from October 2016 to May 2017 as part of Operation Okra, which was the Australian commitment to fighting ISIL in Syria and Iraq. So we now have 50 bombs there for its 50 combat missions and bombing missions against ISIL targets in the Middle East. So that's the most combat, obviously, that the aircraft has seen, bombing of those targets.
So, after 30 years in service, 3 operations in the Middle East and over 6,000 flying hours, what's next for this fighter jet?
So if all things go well, this F-18 will be put on display in the future development, the next generation of Anzac Hall. It's still in the very early stages of design, so how it works we're not sure, but it's definitely planned to put it on display eventually in that new gallery space.
What do you need to do to care for an aircraft like this, which still looks as though it could take off any time? It doesn't look as though it needs any work, but obviously it has to be conserved.
So we have a conservation team that will periodically look at it to see if there's any issues with it. If we were to put it on display, we want to put it on display without any weight on its wings or anything that might, bend the wings or anything. But we're also talking about an aircraft that's designed to be able to turn its G-forces of over 7 G-forces. So
what do you mean by that?
So basically, this plane can turn so quickly that the pilot inside and the airframe itself are experiencing 7 times the gravity of Earth. So the pilots have to wear specialised G-suits to stop them from blacking out in these situations. So the aircraft is designed to be able to sustain very, very powerful turns and G-forces like that. So there's very little that we could do to it that's probably going to damage the skin of it because it's so strong. But we will still be checking it constantly to see if there's any wing warping or anything over time. So we want it to survive for hundreds of years. So we have to look into those things and check them from time to time and make sure that the oils inside aren't going to leak and rust things as well.
I must say, Cameron, when you're so close to a jet fighter like this and you see how small it is inside that Perspex bubble, and after hearing what you say about the forces that operate on an aircraft like this when it's flying, gosh, to be inside must be amazing.
It certainly doesn't look like it's comfortable, but you're experiencing an adrenaline rush that few people on the planet will ever experience, far greater than going on a roller coaster, that's for sure. But you're also going at speeds that mean you have to have reflexes faster than, as fast as a Formula One driver. It's an extremely dangerous mission, but the pilots would all love it, I'm sure.
So, Cameron, what do you think when you look across this vast hall and see the skeleton remains of the oldest plane in the Memorials collection and this stunning technological marvel that is the F-18 Hornet?
I love the comparison, to look at the Depoduson and to see this flimsy aircraft that can only go about 80 kilometres an hour, and then have an aircraft that's only, let's say, 70 years difference, but closer to 60 years difference in technology, that goes 1900 kilometres an hour and can turn at the fastest speeds possible, whereas that the Depoduson turning is an extremely dangerous operation and is the reason why the other one was destroyed, because it just didn't turn very well. So comparing them is just so interesting, and it shows how quickly aviation industry has advanced in the last 100 or so years. So it's a great little comparison to have them next to each other.
I think it also says something about the bravery of the people who fly such machines, whether it's the earliest or the most recent.
Definitely, no matter what you're flying, there's always a high risk to being a pilot. The original pilots, they were building an industry, so they were flying things that may not even fly. The dangers were immense, but they wanted the adrenaline rush. They wanted to be the pioneers of the industry. And the pilots of today too, they go through months and months, years of training to become fighter pilots, and they have to maintain their skills constantly with flying hours, but it's still an exceptionally dangerous job. You have to be made of what they call the right stuff to be able to do it, and I know I certainly couldn't, as much as I would love to.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.